This episode has been sponsored in part by our friends at Veeam. Are you tired of juggling the cost of AWS backups and recovery with your SLAs? Quit the circus act and check out Veeam. Their AWS backup and recovery solution is made to save you money, not that that's the primary goal, mind you, while also protecting your data properly. They're letting you protect 10 instances for free with no time limits, so test it out now. You can even find them on the AWS Marketplace at snark.cloud/backitup. Wait, did I just endorse something on the AWS Marketplace? Wonder of wonders, I did. Look, you don't care about backups, you care about restores. And despite the fact that multi-cloud's a dumb strategy, it's also a realistic reality. So make sure that you're backing up data from everywhere with a single unified point of view. Check them out at snark.cloud/backitup. So AWS booted Parler off of their service on the grounds that calling for the assassination of elected officials was well outside the bounds of AWS's acceptable use policy, and half of the internet is suddenly an expert on reverse cloud migrations. I'm going to ignore all of the political aspects of this and instead focus on the things I have direct experience with: cloud migrations. I've done a number of data center to data center migrations, cloud to cloud migrations, and data center to cloud migrations. I know what it takes to do these things successfully when you have months to plan and basically every vendor on the planet is trying to land your business as opposed to getting rid of you as fast as humanly possible. It's both expensive and it takes ages. So let's dive in. The first argument that they used was, well, we didn't use any AWS-specific services. This is never, ever true for basically anything in AWS. Let's assume you did your best and didn't take very reasonable shortcuts like Elasticache is basically Redis, so we'll just use that, and instead built everything you use on top of Linux instances, or even inside of containers, so you're super portable. After all, this is what Kubernetes promises in return for its Gordian knot of complexity, right? Are you sure you didn't slip and come to rely on Amazon's load balancers, S3 buckets, ACM for certificates, or IAM for controlling access to the environment? Good for you. You avoided all of those traps. No, you didn't, but let's continue. Next, have you accounted for your provisioning process, speaking to freshly spun EC2 instances, but also needing to speak to brand new Pixie-booted servers in a data center? Have you remembered that AWS's network is basically magic and you can get line rate from basically any instance to any other, but this will cause your top-of-rack switches to melt in a data center? Now let's think about economics for a second. Have you forgotten that you pay for EC2 instances by the second and can scale up to serve peak traffic and then scale down? But in a data center, you've got to provision for that peak traffic? You remember that you have to pay for data center rack space, connectivity to the internet. And to be clear, a cross-connect within 30 days is lightning fast, since most facilities require 60 to 90 days of lead time for those. And your servers have to be purchased either all up front or with multi-year contracts tied to leasing arrangements, right? In the best of times, which you can interpret as not during a global pandemic, server order lead times for multi-million-dollar purchases from Dell and HP see 60 days or more of lead time. Oh, and remember as well that the past decade of hosting has seen massive consolidation in data center vendors. Equinix, CoreSite, and Digital Realty Trust are the three big players in this space who absolutely don't want to host actual Nazis. So it's going to be tough to find a vendor that's independent enough to take Parler and has sufficient connectivity to the internet backbone to handle their traffic level without being saturated. What a lot of folks advocating for this think of when going through non-mainstream providers is, in fact, co-located space in one of the big data center operators' buildings. To pull this off, you have to find a data center that is independently owned and operated. This isn't impossible, but it's getting harder every year. You might ask the Pirate Bay how this is working out for them. They constantly have to relocate to new hosting, and the worst thing they do is basically copyright infringement. Now to the ongoing care and feeding of your data center. You've, of course, planned for things as banal as hard drive failures that in AWS are theoretical curiosities only and not a potential production downing emergency if left unhandled, right? You get that things like DDoS mitigation, for example, require massive resources, bandwidth, and experience that you almost certainly don't have, and can no longer procure thanks to every reasonable anti-DDoS provider banning you or ignoring your calls. Correct? You have? Great! Now we're beyond the territory of who will host you and into the next step of higher level services that we've all come to rely upon. You've decided that your business model is giving an unfiltered megaphone to some of the worst people in the world. So the fact that you're any company's customer is going to cut across their branding so severely that there's a great chance that they'll swear you to secrecy before agreeing to take you on, if they do at all. So as a result, everything that you'd normally outsource, from MFA text messages to provisioning authentication to your corporate email service, none of the usual vendors will take your calls because they don't want to have to answer to their own customers' angry emails and tweets. This means that all the undifferentiated heavy lifting that AWS was doing for you is now squarely your responsibility, and you have to get your application up and running. In addition to all of that stuff. Sure, in 1998, we all had to do some variant of this. In 1998, most websites absolutely sucked, and slashdotting was a constant concern that went away entirely because of companies like AWS and Cloudflare making their services available. You know, the companies that just probably banned you. This episode is sponsored in part by our friends at New Relic. If you're like most environments, you probably have an incredibly complicated architecture, which means that monitoring it is going to take a dozen different tools. And then we get into the advanced stuff. We all have been there and know that pain, or will learn it shortly. And New Relic wants to change that. They've designed everything you need in one platform with pricing that's simple and straightforward. And that means no more counting hosts. You also can get one user and 100 gigabytes per month totally free. To learn more, visit newrelic.com. Observability made simple. There are two schools of thought on my observation that this is going to take Parler months to implement, and the clear dividing line between which side someone comes down on is, have they done a cloud migration before? Even migrating from a data center to AWS takes ages, and AWS is hurling technical resources at you to make the path easier. Everything you've got in your data center absolutely exists in AWS. And the migration case studies that are marketing pieces designed to show how easy it is to move to AWS have timelines measured in months or years, not the hours or days that Parler's hoping for. Now, you can say that I'm overstating the difficulty. It's pretty easy to move a tiny site from one provider to another. You can design an architecture on a whiteboard that shows high degrees of portability. The trouble is that here in the real world, each segment of that diagram has to be able to handle massive traffic, because this isn't just a toy problem anymore. Within minutes of their relaunch, Parler would have to be able to handle a few million concurrent users. The thundering herd problem has gotten a lot easier to manage with cloud infrastructure once you get your system's architecture and codebase set up to handle it. But in a data center environment, you've got to provision for peak traffic all the time. Autoscaling isn't a thing that's available to you in that environment. Even folks moving from one AWS account to another, or between AWS regions, find that it's a delicate process that takes months in most cases. There's nuance and sharp edges at every step of the process, and you don't realize that until you've been down this road at least once. Anyone with that kind of experience and the technical expertise to architect a successful migration at this scale has many other options with regard to potential workspaces that don't extend to this. And even then, you're not quite out of the woods. Let's say you get to this point, which is by no means assured. At some point, if your content is horrid, objectionable, or illegal enough, your upstream provider will pull the plug. You're violating the acceptable use policy we have for all of our customers, they'll say, before disabling a router port. Suddenly, your site is no longer on the internet. Host content that's illegal enough, and before you know it, your entire data center has been raided and your servers seized by the FBI, at which point they will generally fail to serve traffic entirely. Fundamentally, all of this is a massively heavy lift, and the headwinds will be against you the entire time. Now then, isn't this an argument for avoiding the cloud entirely? No, my God, what's wrong with you? If your business model extends to AWS might turn us off for how thoroughly we violate their terms of service, great. You get to ignore the last 20 years of technical advancement because you have no other choice. But I don't see building for every cloud provider decided we were too objectionable to host as a reasonable precaution for any sensible business case. And to be frank, I'd be extremely cautious to work with anyone who raised such a concern as a serious consideration in the first place. The TLDR of all of this? Parler is an unpleasant company that I do not respect, in an unpleasant position that I do not envy.
This has been a Humble Pod production. Stay humble.